Welcome to Meet the Lichens. The purpose of these videos is to help you get to know the common and cool lichens you're likely to see in the Bay Area and Northern California. This series is focused on the identification of common lichens by sight. So if you're totally new to lichens, I'd recommend doing some reading first on what lichens are and their basic anatomy because I'm not going to cover that in this series, but there's lots of good resources online. So usually the best way to learn your lichens is to see them up close in the lab or in the field. But since we aren't really able to do that right now, especially in a class setting, I'm going to introduce you to a lichen starter pack of a few lichens at a time. We'll talk about their identifying features, where you're likely to see them, some cool facts about them, as we would if we were encountering them in the field. And this video series was actually designed for a lichen course based in Oakland, California in spring 2020. But most of the lichens that we'll discuss are widespread, so much of what you learn in this series can help you ID lichens actually outside of that region as well. And if you want to get really familiar with these lichens, I'd recommend writing the lichen's name, drawing it, and writing down the key features that stand out to you. You can also try to come up with mnemonic devices to remember the names and features. Another suggestion is to look them up on iNaturalist.org for some more photos. You can see where people have recorded these lichens near you. The IDs on iNaturalist are not always correct, but it's a good picture tool. And then hopefully you'll be able to start seeing these and recognizing them outside in the field. Okay. So the first week's theme is city dwellers, lichens that are very pollution tolerant, sometimes pollution loving, that you're able to find in even some very urban environments. These are some of the lichens you're most likely to see in your yard, on street trees, when you walk around the block, or on a park bench. These are some of the most common lichens, and I really love them for it. These are the lichens that you start to notice most often in your everyday life that you never noticed before. They're all green algal foliose lichens. Their photobiont is a green alga, and they have flattish leafy lobes with a distinct top and bottom. All three that we're going to talk about today typically have pretty tiny lobes, though, and they're very tightly pressed to their substrates, so you might be tempted to call them crustose lichens, and they can sometimes be sort of borderline, but generally if you have a good knife, you can separate them from the substrate and see the lower surface, so they are foliose. All right, first up is one of my very favorite lichens, Xanthoria. So Xanthoria is a genus of lichens known for their bright yellow, often yellow-orange color. And in fact, that's where it gets its name. Xantho is yellow in Latin. Some common names include orange lichen and sunburst lichen. And the most common Xanthoria species are foliose, often what we'd call minutely foliose, which means that the lobes are really tiny, just a millimeter or a few wide. And from a distance, will just often look like this yellow fuzz growing all over a tree. But if you go close and you look close at those lichens, you'll see the little branching lobes, and even cooler, it's tiny, dark orange, little round apothecia. And if you look with your hand lens, you'll be pretty amazed by the tiny worlds you can see growing on your neighborhood street tree. Xanthoria mostly grows on bark, so check those street trees and fallen branches. But it's also pretty common on other structures like wood benches and fences and fiberglass signs. It doesn't usually grow on rocks, but will sometimes, like on gravestones. Like most of the lichens that we'll encounter in this course, Xanthoria is a green algal lichen, and its orange color is a good reminder that being a green algal lichen doesn't mean you'll actually be green. So like many lichens, Xanthoria contains and produces chemical compounds that shape its appearance and lifestyle, and that's how it gets this color. So Xanthoria usually has abundant apothecia, which are dark orange in the middle with the border the same color of the cortex, that lighter yellow. They can also have serratia, but they're much less obvious than the apothecia. From this pigment called parietin. And parietin is thought to act as sort of a sunscreen for the lichen, protecting it from UV rays and allowing Xanthoria to live in these really sunny, very exposed places, like a city street or the outermost branches of a tree or shrub. Xanthoria is also really pollution tolerant, It seems to actually like high amounts of nitrogen, and it does really well in urban and agricultural areas. And it's really great at colonizing new areas, and that's especially true of the most common species we see, Xanthoria pyretina, which is thought to be a non-native species. And Xanthoria can be one of the first lichens to appear after a wildfire. Check about this tiny, tiny baby lichen in this photo you can see in my hand lens that I took at a site about 3 years after wildfire. So it's slow, but there. Okay, next we're going to look at some look-alike species. So Xanthoria's main look-alike is actually a genus called Xanthomendoza, which used to be grouped with Xanthoria into one group. They're pretty difficult to distinguish appearance or with simple tests. So if you see something that fits our description of Xanthoria, know that it could also be this other genus, Xanthomendoza, but for most people's purposes and our purposes, grouping them just as Xanthoria is totally fine. Another lookalike worth knowing about is Caloplaca. This is one of the most common lichens on rocks, especially if you see an orange lichen on rocks. So if you see a bright yellow-orange lichen that's growing on a rock, it is much more likely to be Caloplaca and not Xanthoria. And the last lookalike I want to mention is actually our next featured lichen of this episode of Meet the Lichens, which is Candelaria. So here we have Candelaria, also sometimes called candle flame lichen or lemon lichen. Candelaria has a lot in common with Xanthoria. It's also brightly colored, foliose with very tiny lobes. It's also pollution tolerant and a city dweller. So they're very similar in a lot of ways. The main way to distinguish these two, Xanthoria and Candelaria, in the field is color. So Candelaria is more of a yellow-green color, like lemon lime Gatorade. It's sort of how I think about it. A brief note on the term yellow-green if you're going to be identifying lichens. I am using the phrase yellow-green here because, well, Candelaria looks yellow-green. But you should be aware that yellow-green actually has a very specific meaning in lichen keys, and this is not it. We'll discuss that more in future videos when we get to lichens that are yellow-green in that particular way. But just know for now that if a lichen key says yellow-green, it is not talking about the lemon lime Gatorade color. It is referring to something much more subtle. Okay, moving on. So Candelaria is pretty much always found on bark, and the most common species that you're going to see are Candelaria pacifica and Candelaria concolor. Candelaria can have apothecia, but they're a lot less common than they are with Xanthoria. Candelaria mostly reproduces asexually through serratia. Its lobe tips can be totally covered with serratia. And if you can see the underside, you can check for white risings. But unless you're going to use a knife or something, you often can't see that. Like Xanthoria, Candelaria can be an early colonizer. Here's my favorite Candelaria photo I have. It is a tiny, tiny heart-shaped baby lichen on a burned shrub a few years after a fire. All right, it's time to discuss lookalikes. So we've already discussed Xanthoria, which tends to be more orange and has more apothecia. Sometimes the color of Xanthoria and Candelaria can be pretty similar, especially in the shade or under wet conditions. And if you really want to be sure, a chemical test will tell them apart. Xanthoria turns purple with KOH, potassium hydroxide, while Candelaria does not. Another thing you might see that you could confuse for Candelaria at a distance is the gold dust lichen Chrysothrix. Chrysothrix is what is sometimes called a dust crust. It's one of a relatively small number of lichen species that have no real cortex, and they're mostly made up of powdery serratia. And at a distance, this powdery lichen is sort of similar in color to Candelaria and grows in some similar places like trees and fences. But if you look close, you can tell them apart because you can see the lobes and other clear structures of Candelaria. Another possible lookalike that I don't have photographed here is free-living green algae, which sort of looks like a fence has been tinted lime green. Algae will also be sort of more dispersed without lobes or clear structure. And then one more lookalike is Candelaria has this cute little relative called Candelaria, and this is a crustose lichen that's of the same sort of color, and it's commonly found on rock, unlike Candelaria, which is almost always on bark or wood. And Candelaria is a foliose lichen, so it has tiny leafy lobes that Candelaria won't have. In most cases, you should be able to pry the lobes off the substrate a bit. So those two should be fairly easy to tell apart. All right, our final lichen genus of today is Fishia. So like Xanthoria and Candelaria, this is a hardy, pollution-tolerant, and common in urban and agricultural environments. They're widespread on bark or wood, but Fishias are harder to spot because it doesn't have that bright color of those other two. Instead, it's kind of a drab whitish gray, sometimes a little greenish, with a pale lower surface. And Fishia has small to medium-sized lobes, and Fishia specimens can be just really tiny. So you really kind of need to be looking for lichens to spot it. But once you start looking for lichens, Fishia are hiding in plain sight just absolutely everywhere. So here's the thing about Fishias, though, is that there are many, many species of Fishias, and some of those have really clear defining features like lobes with a unique shape or cilia, but others can be very hard to identify. And the lichenologists I know will sometimes send their specimens off to a known Fishia expert. So they are hard if you want to get down to species. The different species can have variable reproductive structures. Some species do have apothecia. They're usually dark brown with margins the color of the cortex, sometimes with little crystals, little pruina. But other species, they don't have apothecia. Some species are distinguished by little cilia growing off of them, but lots of them do not have that. So it can be tricky, but here's what you should know. The tiny foliose white-gray lichens that are on nearly every branch you pick up, those are Fishias, so make that your first guess. All right, lookalikes. So the main lookalike genus is probably Fisconia, which is doubly confusing because their names are similar. Fisconias are often darker in color or are recognizable in other ways. Fishes do turn yellow with a KOH spot test, while Fisconia does not. But just know that if you're trying to identify a possible Fishia, you can flip a few pages over in your book and also check out Fisconia. You might also mix them up with lichens of a similar green-gray color like Parmelia or Parmelina. These have other features to set them apart, like cracks in the thallus on Parmelias or a dark lower surface. Just remember that Fishias are some of the most common lichens around. So if you see tiny little lobes and gray-green and it's not clearly something else, Fishia is a good bet, especially if you are in an urban environment. Okay, that's our first three lichen genera. In review, Xanthoria is yellow-orange, tiny with orange apothecia. Candelaria, more yellow-green with apothecia, less common. And Fishia is tiny white or gray, sometimes with brown apothecia or cilia. All of them are absolutely everywhere, so go forth and lichenize and look for them on your street trees. That's it for episode 1. See you next time.